English translation, what is the true self-love? And what is the detrimental narcissistic ego love? By Billy Edward Albert Meier. Self-love.
Unfortunately, self-love, in the philosophy as well as in the psychology and in the general common understanding, is interpreted completely wrongly and is portrayed as a self-flattering factor connected with vanity. This, however, corresponds to a completely wrong understanding, because this named factor of self-flattering vanity applies solely to the ego love, which actually is egocentric, narcissistic, and selfish-egotistic, and refers blatantly to one's own person. However, an explanation about that shall follow at a later place. Self-love in relation to the human being does not refer to himself or herself, rather solely to all his or her good and positive values, which are loved and appreciated. Therefore, this form of love concerning the human being is not selfish and not self-involved. Rather, it is directed at values alone and consequently comprises his or her inner and external nature, his or her true humaneness with the values of an active and rightly-valueful consciousness activity, as well as the character, the personality, and the modes of behavior in relation to the world of thoughts and feelings, the carrying out of actions and deeds, as well as all values of honesty, righteousness, and dignity, and so on. Self-love is very important for a happy, satisfied, and fulfilled life, and one of the factors responsible for the life conduct and the personal well-being, which leads to self-determinedly and successfully walking one's own way through life. However, if the human being lacks self-love, then frequently problems pertaining to the thoughts, feelings, and psyche grow in him or her, which lead to unhappiness and unsatisfaction. Therefore, he or she must indulge in self-love and also practice it, because it corresponds to the necessity for his or her lifelong growth, and is to him or her a golden place for joy, inner peace, and his or her own inner freedom and harmony. For the human being, self-love is absolutely worthwhile, and it has no connection at all to a blatant egoism, narcissism, or to egocentrism, because it is absolutely social or moral and an important part of his or her self-acceptance. However, he or she can create true, deep-grounding self-love in himself or herself only if he or she does a corresponding self-analysis in the form of a self-cognition, and from that then also lets a self-realization follow, whereby this form of love is also based in his or her own inner and outer nature, as well as in his or her personal characteristics and modes of behavior. This form of love also includes everything which corresponds to his or her habits, inclinations, and talents, as well as all that which is to be evaluated about and in him or her as advantages and disadvantages, as well as strengths and weaknesses. However, this also includes that one's own errors and omissions are accepted by oneself, and one grants oneself forgiveness. The self-acceptance thereby does not mean that he or she moves in the framework of an absolutely full development, because firstly, such exists only in absolutely relative form, and secondly, it is not the case that he or she shall not change any more and not further evolve in consciousness, because the learning and the developing, as well as the collecting of knowledge and wisdom, continue on throughout the entire life. Before each change, however, first comes the recognition of that which is effective, that which corresponds to the reality and its truth. However, everything else which is done outside of this recognition and the evolutive endeavoring remains for the human being a struggle for the existence and for purely material things, whereby he or she wastes his or her life power. Also belonging to the self-love is that the human being fulfills all his or her unavoidable needs and wishes, as he or she also deems them to be serious and important, because these belong to the self-respect and show most varied forms. Belonging to that is that he or she consciously pays attention to his or her health and his or her physical and consciousness thought feeling psyche be aced well-being, as well as that he or she brings to fruition his or her own dreams and wishes and leads them to fulfillment. From self-love, a large part of his or her feeling of self-worth grows, and with it the certainty that he or she is an amiable and valuable human being. In turn, this certainty is decisively involved with his or her self-confidence, which also strengthens his or her inner security that he or she can create and achieve something, and practically even everything, in and of himself or herself. Whatever he or she sets out to change in himself or herself for the better, good, and positive. In addition, that is the prerequisite, therefore, to be able, in equal value, to esteem and love oneself and also one's fellow human beings, namely in an honest form, and thereby without any hypocrisy, excessive expectations, or attempts to change. For the human being, there are always good reasons to check again and again what the condition of his or her self-love is, whereby he or she continuously has to consider how he or she can still increase it and how he or she can nourish and cherish it better. He or she must not love himself or herself as it appears in the case of the ego love. Rather, he or she must care for the true self-love, because it alone has the greatest influence on his or her entire well-being, specifically on his or her feeling of self-worth and self-confidence, and it, the self-love, is in constant dialogue with his or her inner and outer nature. The words with which he or she thinks about himself or herself, and from which he or she develops feelings, whereby, with his or her thoughts, he or she internally talks with himself or herself, have a tremendous might. And through them a cycle is created. Consequently, the thoughts and feelings also influence his or her actions and his or her modes of behavior. Therefore, it is possible that he or she communicates with himself or herself in a loving and strengthening, but also in a belittling and scathing form, and accordingly has a positive or negative effect on his or her consciousness, thought, feeling, psyche, based well-being. However, to change his or her inner self-talk to the purely positive needs great attention, motivation, knowledge, patience, and very active practice again and again. In fact, it is so that the self-love can be learned, and thereby it is about meditative exercises, which are very time-occupying for the human being, which, however, can thereby help him or her to continuously create and increase, to nourish, to cherish, and to maintain his or her self-love, so that he or she regularly and again does something good for himself or herself, if he or she again and again repeats and carries out the exercises at intervals suitable to him or her. 4 meditative exercises are very helpful for this, which should be carried out at least once daily, whereby on each day, however, also 2 or 3 can be practiced. Thereby, it is important that the 4 meditation exercises are carried out alternately, so therefore a different one each time if possible.
First meditative exercise.
That is an exercise which is already very engaging for the human being. In fact, no matter whether he or she himself or herself had the idea to develop self-love, or whether he or she has come upon it through any teaching. Thereby, it is important that he or she is motivated and willing and can develop joy about the whole thing. Therefore, may he or she regularly take time for a meditative leisure exercise, that is to say, a short meditation, which simply is directed towards tranquility and being without thoughts. Thereby, it is very advantageous if he or she does it once a day for 15 to 20 minutes. Whereas during the actual spare time on the weekend, he or she then takes 1, 2, or more hours in order to move about and go for a walk in nature, meditatively immersed in good, loving, and friendly thoughts. However, he or she can also indulge in quietude alternatingly at home or in the garden or somewhere in the forest or field, and with a suitable device immerse himself or herself sense-based meditatively in good music appealing to him or her. If he or she does nothing and lies quietly in order to restingly recover, then on that occasion he or she can also immerse himself or herself meditatively in light and exhilarating thoughts and feelings, in order to do good and positive things thereby, and to refresh himself or herself psychically. Again and again he or she must treat himself or herself to these times in any case, because he or she is worthy of it and necessarily needs it, whereby in addition these idle meditative activities have an effect on him or her in a very sustained form and act more quickly than any chemical or naturally derived sedative.
Second meditative exercise.
In this exercise, it is about one's own attention, which must be formed in such a way that the human being awards love to himself or herself and perceptibly holds it in himself or herself. For that he or she may, in the evening, when he or she has already eaten his or her evening meal at least an hour before, take any old time at all to himself or herself, preferably when it is already dusk or dark. He or she may take a candle, light it up, sit down comfortably and turn off the light. Thereby may he or she meditatively let his or her thoughts and feelings roam through everything that has been beautiful in his or her life up until now, and experience in memory everything just as he or she got to know it and experienced it. May he or she give himself/herself this attention, delight in it, and let everything come to life again in himself/herself in good and loving thoughts and feelings. Therefore may he or she enjoy all the beautiful memories and connect them with all the good and loving thoughts and feelings that he or she is able to muster up for it, in order to internalize them and make them a part of his or her inner and outer nature. May he or she thereby keep in mind all that which he or she quite especially likes about himself or herself personally, and what shows up in his or her memories. May he or she accept everything with joy and love and celebrate it for himself or herself as something special, simply just so, without having to create a special occasion or reason for it. The whole thing initially appears to him or her perhaps silly and strange. However, precisely such self-attentions, which are based on memory, correspond to one's own affections, which help him or her very much in himself or herself to build up and also to maintain self-love for himself or herself in order to appreciate himself or herself. This also applies if he or she in this regard, that is to say, in such a phase of self-attention, has not fulfilled or achieved anything, because all that which he or she has already worked out and achieved up until now incessantly continues to have an effect in him or her. When he or she has actually acquired a healthy self-worth, then he or she is no longer dependent on a constant approval and ongoing successes, because his or her self-worth realization, which he or she has created, automatically continues to have an effect.
Third meditative exercise.
It is necessary that the human being again and again dedicates himself or herself meditatively to a theme, which is directed at the realization of his or her own needs, wishes, and zila. Thereby especially of importance are those of which he or she has been dreaming in his or her life already for a long time, which up until now, however, he or she has not tackled, and which have not been transformed into reality. This is the case because due to invalid reasons he or she has been procrastinating over and over again and delaying everything further. Now, however, it is the case that he or she consciously strives for everything in regard to needs, dreams, and wishes, and he or she meditatively makes an effort to build up his or her motivation and his or her will in order to finally realize that which is to be striven for. And if henceforth one thing or another is really put into practice and the seal reached, then in the human being joy and love come about for having achieved what he or she wanted. This in turn strengthens the self-love and creates a gladness as well as a peaceful and harmonious inner state, together with the cognition of being free in oneself and of being able to tackle and achieve everything oneself. That strengthens one's own security and triggers self-loving impulsations. For this realization meditation, the human being ought to take time at least twice per week, and each time carry out the exercise for 15 to 20 minutes. Thus, it must not be for hours, rather each time only the previously mentioned time of 15 to 20 minutes. Even less time, if it is not otherwise possible, achieves much already. Already the good thoughts and feelings alone, because everything is finally tackled, which brings a better, good, positive, as well as happier and satisfied life, allow the human being to attain visible successes over time. If he or she, step by step, really does the necessary things for that which he or she really wants to achieve, then the meditation exercises must be important to him or her, because through them he or she, step by step, progresses more and more in his or her self-love and reaches the zeal.
Fourth meditative exercise.
This meditative practice is about self-caring values for one's own body, the consciousness, the thoughts, feelings, and the psyche. The whole thing can be beneficial and relaxing, sometimes, however, also strenuous, because it requires not only a meditative effort, rather also a physical effort, which must be satisfied because the whole thing is also connected with valueful nutrition as well as with a minimum of physical exercise. That means that it is necessary that the human being often enough exercises outdoors, strolls in the woods and meadows, and that he or she practices gymnastics or suitable sport, whereby he or she also has to ingest sufficient food that is physically tolerable, which does not burden him or her in any wise and does not cause him or her discomfort. To his or her self-care also belong conscious relaxation time and downtime during which he or she does nothing else but to simply give himself or herself over to idleness and to indulge in rest and quietude. He or she can also do that by taking a soothing bath or by having a massage. The forementioned exercises are suggestions for how the human being can build up self-love in himself or herself and strengthen and maintain it. Thereby, he or she must encourage himself or herself to form everything according to his or her own sense and ability as it appeals to him or her and as it suits him or her. To maintain a meditative practice means that the human being regularly has to do something with honor and dignity and fulfills a self-imposed obligation, which brings him or her benefit and success in some respects. Hence, it therefore absolutely needs his or her motivation, his or her will, his or her commitment, and his or her self-discipline as well as his or her power for it, so that he or she perseveringly sticks with it and does all that which is important, because only then successes and effects appear. However, the whole thing also means that he or she must not undertake too much and not load too much onto himself or herself at once. Actually, he or she must always choose that which appeals to him or her the most and suits him or her. Thus, he or she must also choose how he or she must vary everything in order to cure himself or herself in the form that he or she becomes happy and satisfied. Thereby, he or she can also use his or her imagination and allow it to give useful and valueful suggestions in order to realize them for his or her benefit. Naturally, there are still many further possibilities to further the self-love, as for example, through the inner strengthening of the affirmations of himself or herself and all values connected with that. Also, the training of the consciousness can be a very great useful help for the origination, furtherance, and expansion of the self-love. Self-love also requires, among other things, that the human being is fair, good, and positive, however not iniquitously hard and not loveless to himself or herself, rather happy and satisfied. He or she must not treat himself or herself badly and not bully himself or herself. Rather, he or she must honestly learn to love all the good, positive, and valueful values which are characteristic of him or her, From that arises the term self-love. And the more the human being nourishes, cherishes, and loves all his or her values, as they are described above, the more his or her self-love develops and strengthens. It is indeed easily said that he or she shall learn self-love. However, in order to create it, a determining motivation, a strong will as well as patience and time are required, because self-love is a constantly growing process. The life thereby indicates that the human being shall learn to love himself or herself more, whereby it also constantly tests him or her regarding whether he or she has undertaken that already, or whether he or she still lazes about in the old wrong and self-loveless conditioning and wastes his or her life. Developing self-love means to know and to love all one's own values and to be awake in the here and now, because only therethrough can the human being utilize his or her skills and his or her knowledge in order to learn self-love, develop it, and usefully apply and implement it for himself or herself and for the fellow human beings as well as for all life. These, however, are two different factors, because to learn self-love and then also to live it, on one hand for oneself, on the other hand also in regard to making use of it, in regard to the fellow human beings, and everything that exists in general, is as different as the colors black and white. Just as knowledge and action are fundamentally two different values, so it is also with the self-love in regard to the human being himself or herself and the fellow human beings, as well as with regard to everything else that exists. The human being thereby must understand rightly that to love his or her own values does not mean that he or she simply shall love himself or herself as a person with all inadequacies in regard to modes of behavior, and that which is negative. Rather, it states that he or she has to care for his or her high values, and indeed just as they really are. Consequently, in this regard, there is neither a bad conscience nor extreme or mild feelings of guilt. If he or she follows this way of the self-love, then through the learning of the self-love, he or she will achieve a life of happiness and confidence, of joy and inner peace, of freedom and harmony. The life tests the human being constantly, regarding whether he or she learns self-love. That is to say, whether he or she enables himself or herself to develop it through his or her motivation and will, and whether he or she brings everything to fruition for himself or herself and for the fellow human beings, for everything that lives and for everything that exists in general. Thereby, for the testing of his or her self-love, the life goes very many different ways, which often appear peculiar to him or her, for example, in the way he or she treats his or her fellow human beings, the nature and its fauna and flora. However, it can also be that another test consists of how he or she deals with his or her family members, or with other fellow human beings close to him or her, or also with strangers. Perhaps he or she gets involved with human beings who devalue him or her, who treat him or her badly, lie to, cheat, steal from, deceive, or slander him or her. The possibilities of such tests are many, and thereby he himself, she herself, must understand to define what is right and what is wrong, if he or she must say yes or no, and how he or she must react with his or her self-love in regard to all these things. Truly, it is not always easy to react in love, even if he or she carries self-love in himself or herself, because as the case may be, one moment his or her impulsations swing up and then down again, however to balance themselves again in the best-case scenario. That also corresponds to self-love and simply belongs to the learning. The more the human being learns and lives the self-love, the more he or she is able to unconditionally accept and love his or her fellow human beings and the entire environment as they really are. If he himself, she herself, fosters the self-love in the right form, then he or she also appreciates all human beings and loves them due to all their humaneness and all their good and positive values. Therethrough he or she gains many advantages for himself or herself and all his or her values, which he or she can always improve further. And therewith also advantages for his or her life conduct and lifestyle come to him or her, because his or her self-love brings him or her to the center of his or her life. Effectively, it is carried by the life itself, and therewith everything is full of harmony and respect. Consequently, this form of love detaches itself from his or her own being, separate in himself or herself and his or her feeling of separateness in himself or herself, and leads him or her to the being, one with himself or herself. Therethrough he or she is one with himself or herself, and there is no division in him or her anymore. In this state, he or she evaluates everything much less negatively and badly. Rather, he or she behaves neutrally, wherethrough he or she does not value other human beings in regard to something, and consequently he or she leaves them be as they are. Through the love, namely, he or she learns to remain himself or herself, and also to let other human beings be themselves. Thus, he or she also does not get upset about others anymore when they do something wrong. Rather, according to his or her self-love and the obligation arising from it in regard to the instruction of the ones close to him or her, at the most he or she makes him or her aware of his or her wrong thinking and acting in order to direct him or her onto the right way. Fundamentally, the human being is one with himself or herself, because he or she knows that neither he or she nor another human being is perfect, and that everyone has to put his or her own house in order. Nothing can push him or her away from the self-love, apart from his or her own inadequate unvalues, which he or she has not yet consciously recognized, which he or she, however, rejects and does not want to have, once he or she becomes aware of them. In fact, all love of this world is fundamentally and first and foremost built on self-love, but it is difficult for him or her to understand it. Wherefore, he or she must develop his or her self-confidence and his or her self-consciousness, because only those two factors let him or her recognize that also all other forms of love, which he or she is effectively capable of as a human being, are contained in his or her self-love if he or she only develops them in the first place. And the fact is that if he or she cultivates the self-love in himself or herself, then he or she feels comfortable in his or her skin, and as such a human being, he or she can also forgive himself or herself, as well as the fellow human beings for errors. Thus, at any time, he or she can look at himself or herself in the mirror in esteem, without having to become embarrassed. The self-love changes constantly because it develops out of a bundle of thoughts about all of the human being's own values. How much self-love he or she develops thereby depends first of all on how well he or she gets to know himself or herself, which means how well he or she is conscious of his or her self being conscious of oneself, which has all imaginable good and positive values inherent, thus of his or her consciousness, his or her thoughts, feelings, the psyche, his or her modes of action and behavior, as well as of his or her knowledge and the love and wisdom and so forth. All this, however, he or she can only understand through his or her self-love and by fathoming himself or herself in self-cognition. What effect his or her self-love has in dealing with other human beings thereby depends on how those human beings feel and how they think about him or her. For example, if he or she is honestly appreciated, then this has a very favorable effect on his or her self-confidence. The more a human being means to him or her, the greater the effect. However, if he or she is unfairly criticized, then his or her self-confidence is burdened. Then he or she can clearly feel it with bad thoughts and feelings, and therefore also in his or her psyche. Self-love has something to do with success in life, because if the human being cultivates it, then doors to his or her success open. However, if he or she still wrestles with himself or herself in regard to self-love, then he or she uses up very much energy in order to harmonize himself or herself. This energy then is no longer available to him or her anymore for a successful action. If he or she learns the self-love and cares for it, then he or she will also become more self-confident and a self-assured human being, who more infrequently gets serious problems in life. If and for how long he or she requires exercises for his or her self-love depends to a large extent on his or her present state. Also playing a great role is how much love he or she has so far already received in his or her personal living environment, because a loving, caring support and a good conversational tone in his or her circle of family, acquaintances, and friends helps him or her with the creating of self-love. The human being with genuine self-love has no desire to artificially push himself or herself to the foreground. And if he or she meets a human being with much genuine self-love, then he or she recognizes him or her by the fact that he or she finds him or her likable from the outset and feels comfortable with him or her from the beginning when he or she is together with him or her, because he or she is equalized, honest, relatively always in a good mood, and radiates a recognizable inner quietude. Such a human being also appears natural. He or she does not expect that the other one bends over for him or her, which also contributes to the fact that he or she appears agreeable, and he or she is glad to be able to be in the company of the other.
Ego love.
Already in ancient times, Nocedemian taught through the spiritual teaching that the nature of the ego love is completely different to the self-love, because the ego love form belongs to the narcissism, to the strongly formed egoism, and to the boastfulness and so forth, whereby the whole corresponds to a personality disorder. Ego love is to be understood in this sense alone, and indeed especially if it is distinct and negative, because then it is, as explained, an epitome of narcissistic selfishness and boastfulness. Unfortunately, in psychology and theology, this is fundamentally misunderstood, and therefore the ego love is wrongly equated with the self-love. Ego love, however, is an Ausartung in the form that the human being loves himself or herself in a narcissistic egoistic form so much that he or she turns his or her body and his or her nature and all his or her actions and modes of behavior and so forth into a temple of roaring self-interest. According to this point of view in respect to the ego love, the hardcore self-loving one behaves completely egocentrically and bumptiously because he or she simply loves himself or herself as an individual and correspondingly behaves like someone in love with himself or herself. In this wise, as a pronounced ego-addicted one, he or she is absolutely incapable of loving other human beings or even displaying a touch of an impulsation equal to love. In respect to relationships, the ego-loving one has solely his or her ego in sight. For the human being, ego love means that he or she places himself or herself at the center of attention of everything, whereby in his or her blatant infatuation with his or her ego, as a result of lacking empathy for the fellow human beings and everything that exists, he or she only cares about himself or herself. Therefore, he or she neglects the others. The spiritual teaching teaches that ego love is based on lacking or unstable self-esteem as well as diverse other factors, whereby it originally is based on a wrong baby-parent relationship in the form that the child was not treated with sufficient recognition and with deep feelings for him or her. A pronounced ego love, also called I love, because it is based on an egocentricity, means that the human being is mainly turned towards himself or herself, has a rather passive need for love, and only loves other human beings in order to be loved. A relationship with an ego-loving one is formed by his or her giving and taking, whereby in this regard there is no balance with alternating giving and taking. A human being who has fallen prey to ego love is hardly or not at all capable of empathy. Consequently, he or she therefore cannot bring forward any feeling for others. If the human being is caught up in self-love, then he or she has hardly any self-esteem or none at all. Therefore, he or she is constantly dependent on external reassurances. If these fail to appear, then significant problems arise for him or her. The thing that thereby also appears is the fact that the ego-loving one, at least the very negative-behaving one, is inclined to devalue the fellow human beings in order to upvalue his or her own ego. Viewed according to the spiritual teaching, in a pathological form, the ego love corresponds to a personality disorder just as much as the narcissism does, for which reason the latter is also mentioned in connection with the ego love and the egoism, and so forth. As a rule, the ego love shows grand thoughts and feelings of the human being's own importance, and the world of thoughts and feelings also indulges in grandiose fantasies about limitless success, and might, indeed, right up to the wrong belief in one's own specialness. Thereby also appears the desire for an excessive admiration from the fellow human beings, as well as an exaggerated thinking in regard to entitlements. Thereby also extreme, exploitative relationships are the order of the day, as well as arrogance and envy. In addition to that come very unstable thoughts of self-esteem and corresponding feelings. Frequently, thereby an inner emptiness and the inability to perceive joy also appears. However, in a human being with a distinct ego love, it also emerges that he or she goes around with an increased offendedness, vulnerability, and an often excessive egocentric attitude, which additionally is also very strongly characterized by an arrogance, unrelatedness, and with egoism towards other human beings. The characteristic attitude of the human being, who in strict negative wise is connected to his or her ego love, shows exaggerated demands and an ambition that frequently leads to a fatigue syndrome. And naturally, it is then thereby the case that, as a rule, one's own machinations are not seen, which are to blame for it, rather the fellow human beings and external causes. For example, the darned work, the superior or the circumstances of the entire environment are held responsible for it. Depressive upsets also appear, which have vapid or superficial effects, whereby the present lacking impetus motivation and lacking buoyancy is experienced as very burdening. If thereby the physical level of the very blatant ego-loving one is viewed and considered, then functional heart trouble can be observed as well as headaches, sleep disorders, and sexual disorders. If closer contacts with the fellow human beings exist, then the self-involved ego-loving ones can indeed appear to be very lively, charming, and engaging, which however only serves to achieve something. Thereby they can then also appear very manipulative and often present themselves in a form which appears emotionally cool, if need be, however can also be very arrogant and hurtful.
Addendum.
According to an old prediction, the human beings born after 1982 are the self-loveless generation of the recent past, and they are rather distant from a social orientation. Therefore, there are more and more young persons who develop few sustainable social relationships, who cannot integrate socially, and who, in the end, ego-lovingly put themselves at the center of attention. This tendency towards self-lovelessness has already been drifting into the workplace for a long time, because it is no longer as communicative as it used to be. Today, the human being sits lonely in front of the computer, and more all areas of work are only controlled by one woman or one man at the computer. These firms lead to human beings becoming robot beings, and that in turn leads to the complete wasting away of their abilities to empathize with others. Additionally, more and more technical things in the surrounding world are developed, such as electronic media, mobile phones, and computer games, etc., with which the human being in the end is often alone and becomes lonely. Furthermore, many parents, based on their own experiences, are no longer able to raise their children in the right form. And in regard to a future professional success, Very early on, the children are trimmed to learn something that will bring in much money. This besides the fact that the same parents do not teach their children anymore to create self-love, and they do not stimulate them for it from a very early age. On the contrary, they teach revenge and retribution, and that they shall have no consideration for other human beings. Sim Yase Silver Star Center, the 14th of June 2014, 018 HRS Billy.